Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me in this YouTube live. I am just sharing the link with you. Uh, wait a bit. I hope you can hear me in this YouTube live. I am just sharing the link with you. Uh, wait a bit. Yes. So, if you can hear me, please write in the YouTube chat box so that I can understand whether you are being able to hear me or not. In the last two classes, sorry for the technical glitch that happened, that occurred. So, we all know that the technology is quite new to all of us. So, we are gradually grappling with the whims of technology, the nuances of it, so on and so forth. Yes, Dipanita. Thank you. Thank you, Dipanita, for commenting. Yes. And thank you, Amrita. Yes. So the point that I was discussing in the last class was yes. Thank you, Shilpi, Shudipta, Amrita, Dipanita, all of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So yes, let me share the screen and let us discuss the first page of Amitav Ghosh novel. Yes. So, can you see the screen? Can you see the screen? You can see the screen, right? Just write yes. Any one of you. You can see the screen, right? Okay. So, in the last class, I told you about the shadowy presence of memory in the narrative, and how the narrator in the novel is an unreliable narrator. It's not the stable chronological narration that the novel follows. Rather, you find so many narrative intercuts, so many narrative interjections within the narrative. And that's what makes the novel very personal. It's a memory novel. And that's why the shadow becomes more important than the documented one. The oral history becomes more important than the actual written documented one, the chronological one. This novel deals with the duality between chronology and orality. This novel deals with the duality between the political and the personal. This novel also deals with the duality between Devi and Thakuma. Why this duality between Devi and Thakuma? If you read the first few lines of the text, you understand that the narrator seeks to decolonize Maya Takuma from the identity of an intimate grandmother. And and Takuma is being projected as Devi. Right. So this metamorphosis makes the personal the political. So there is an imbrication between the political and the personal in the identity of Maya Devi. Yes, you can ask me a question that Devi is also a feminine stereotype. Takuma is also a feminine stereotype. But think about this. Takuma has a specific gender role. Devi, the question of Devi exceeds that gender role. So this exceeding of gender role, this exceeding of the sphere of intimacy to the sphere of sociality, to put it in this way, makes Maya Devi an epitome of archetypal independent womanhood. Maya Devi an epitome of archetypal independent womanhood. She is not someone to be curbed within the threshold of domesticity. She is not someone to be constricted within the familial identity of an intimate space. Rather, for her, the personal always gets overshadowed by the dominant political and social presence. At that point of time, a woman like Maya Devi made inroads into the society, And by making inroads into the society, they made a political statement that women were advancing. Women were not meant to be within the four houses of within the fourfold spaces of domesticity. So that kind of a political statement that Maya Devi makes in the novel, and that's why Maya Thakuma gets evolved into Maya Devi. The question of Devi is also a feminine stereotype, but that feminine stereotype of Devi is way different from the feminine stereotype of mother or grandmother. So this recognizes a different kind of role of woman in the society. This recognizes a different kind of definition of woman in the society. And this is where the novel breaks barriers. This is where the novel breaks molds. This is where Maya Devi makes her inroads. And this is how the duality between political and the personal is negotiated. This is where the duality between personal and the political is forged. So, this is how the novel deals with the dualities. I told you about the duality of the shadow and the reality, that whether the shadow is more important or the reality, whether the spectral, unheard past is more important or the reality that you are inhabiting, whether the history of a forgotten past more important or the living present is more important. How can you posit is yourself in the present, in the perpetual presence, without being uh, without being conscious of your roots, without being conscious of your multiple lineages, and your root always is intersectional. It's not one root. It's always in an entangled space. It always converges multiple roots together, and that makes your past largely heterogeneous. That makes your past largely entangled. That makes your past largely intricate. And this novel, Shadow Lines, is a detour through those intricate alleyways of past, through those intricate layers of past. And it also talks about the intermingling of various aspects of past, various layers of past, how our past has been informed by different intersections, different interstices, different gaps, different ruptures, different mergers, so on and so forth. The uncanny presence of past remains hauntingly in the narrative. The narrative is haunted by an uncanny presence of the past. That's why the title of the novel is Shadow Lines. And if you look at the name of Maya Devi also, the word Maya also means also means a kind of an illusion, as if she was an illusory character, as if she was far from her time. She was a, she was an illusory presence in a time, as if she was from the other world. That's why Maya Devi, Maya, right? And also, in the Indian terminology, Maya is the world of consciousness, the world of undifferentiated consciousness. So she was both the consciousness and the illusion. Her presence was both the consciousness of a generation and an illusion. That's why she was Maya Devi. That's why her presence haunted the narrator. The narrator is taking a dive into the memory lane, and the memory lane is imbricated by so many layers. so many so many aspects that are perhaps untranslatable in words. So let us continue with the novel. Mahadevi was 29 when they left, and Tridib was 8. Over the years, although I cannot remember when it happened any more than I can remember when I first learned to tell the time or tie my shoelaces, I have come to believe that I was 8 too when Tridib first talked to me about their journey. I remember trying very hard to imagine him back to my age, to reduce his height to mine, and to think away the spectacles that were so much a part of him that I really believed he had been born with them. It was not easy for me. He looked old, impossibly old, and I could not remember him looking anything other than old. Though, in fact, at the time, he couldn't have been much older than 29. In the end, since I had nothing to go on, I had decided that he had looked like me. So, this portion is totally about the relativity of perception, about the unreliability of a child narrator, that he had looked like me, I decided, but he looked old, but he had looked like me. That means the question of time, the question of looking like someone or being analogous to someone depends totally on your perception, totally on your impression, the impression that you cast on others, the impression that you have on others, the optic through which you look at other people. And it's clear that it's clear that the narrator had an effective affinity with Tridib. Tridib was 8. Whether Tridib was old or not, whether Tridib was born with spectacles or not, the narrator had some kind of a curiosity for it. And this curiosity makes Tridib, the idol of the narrator. Tridib becomes the idol of the narrator. Tridib is someone who the narrator idolizes, at least in the first portion of the novel. It's some Tridib is someone against which the narrator is placed. দেখো যদি প্রথম থেকে ইয়ে করি, ত্রিদীপের এগেনস্টে কিন্তু নিজেকে বারবার পজিট করার চেষ্টা করি। ত্রিদীপ কি আমার বয়সের ছিল? ত্রিদীপের বয়স কি 29 ছিল? So this is how things are played out in the novel. The Trideep remains a shadowy presence for the narrator, as is Mayadevi. It's not merely Mayadevi, it's also Trideep who also remains a shadowy presence for the narrator. And the narrator presents his identity vis-a-vis Trideep. But my grandmother, when I asked her, was very quick to contradict me. She shook her head firmly, looking up from her school books, and said, "No, he looked completely different, not at all like you." So this unreliability of memory was verified by someone from the older generation. So Tridip look like me? So it's a memory that's transmitted through different documents. It's called the post memory. It's called the post memory. Let me use hear it. Okay, post memory. So it can it be done full screen? I don't know how to do it full screen. Okay. Yes, perhaps it's full screen now. Okay. Uh, So the identity of Trideep to the narrator was transferred in a mediated manner. It was mediated through different documents, and that's why it's called the post memory. It's mediated through stories. It's not the direct memory of the narrator. Rather, the memory that the narrator receives about Tridip is post memory. It's deferred, or it's mediated by someone else. It's mediated by something else. That's what Marian Hicks call post memory. Post memory. It's a post memory of Trideep that the narrator holds. That the narrator holds. But whether the memory is correct or not is verified by the grandmother. The grandmother also belongs to the generation of Trideep. So clearly, the novel is about the unreliability of memory. Memory is an unreliable anchor of looking back. Memory is an unreliable optic of gazing back at the past. Gazing back at the past. You cannot have uh, you cannot have a proper concrete foothold on the past with memory. Memory is always a very slippery, very treacherous, very complex domain. It always mixes and matches different impressions, different images. And when you get driven by, when you get carried away by other documents, it's bound to mislead you. It's bound to take you through a detour. And this is what is happening in Shadow Lines. In Shadow Lines, you are having a detour through a series of images that those images might be false, those images might be misleading, those images might be incorrect, those images might be totally figments of imagination and so on, but images are important in the context of the novel, as are the shadows. So images embedded in the shadows, or vice versa, shadows embedded in the images. So that's how the narrative creates an order of memory, tries to create an order of memory in the text, tries to create an order of things. Foucault calls it an order of things, an order of memory, because the past is totally broken. The past is totally fragmented. The past is totally unrepresentable. And you look at, or you just rely on the unreliability of your memory in order to retrieve a past that is totally lost, in order to retrieve characters like Maya Takuma or Tridip. So the novel begins in a very interesting manner. The novel begins in a very fascinating manner, where the unreliability of memory comes to the foreground, where the ruptures in the memory are also explored. How memory is full of ruptures, full of gaps, full of silences, full of unspoken words. So, memory cannot give you a full fledged picture of the reality that you want to capture, that you want to grasp. That's why this novel is so important. This novel is uh, titled as the shadow lines. The shadow line is not the line of memory. It's neither the line of the present. It lies somewhere in between the line of the memory and the line of the present. So it's the in betweenness that keeps the shadow alive. It's the in betweenness that makes the shadow speak, so to speak. And this is how the shadow and the present are intertwined. This is how the shadow and the reality are intertwined. So this novel takes you through an aporia, takes you through an unresolved dilemma between shadow and the reality. My grandfather did not approve of Tridip. He is a loafer and a wastrel. I would sometimes hear her saying to my parents, he does not do any proper work, lives off his father's money. To me, she would only allow herself to say with a sardonic little twist of her mouth, I don't want to see you loafing about with Tridip. Tridip wastes time. So Tridip was an idler. Tridip, as a character, was an idler. So grandmother, the grandmother was totally interpolated by the colonial logic of work, that if someone has to live a proper life, he has to have a proper engagement, he has to have a proper employment, he has to have a proper work, কাজ করতে হবে, সময় নষ্ট করা যাবে না. So this time of this concept of wasting time, this concept of non-conforming or not conforming to the colonial logic of time or colonial logic of working time is something very interesting. Tridip as a character was an idler. He used to loaf around. He used to waste the money of his father. That means Tridip did not conform to the colonial logic of work culture. What the colonial logic of work culture taught the Indian people, that you have to have a proper utilization of time for your advancement of career. So you have to utilize your time properly, you have to channelize your time properly, and in order to have proper development of your in order to have a proper development of yourself, that is, the time should be used in an utilitarian manner. Time should have a utility. Time should have a utilitarian perspective. ইউটিলিটারিয়ান পার্সপেক্টিভ থাকা উচিত সময়ের মধ্যে, সময়ের একটা নির্দিষ্ট ইউটিলিটারিয়ান গোল থাকা উচিত. দ্যাটস দ্য colonial logic of time propounded, that the concept of work time and the concept of leisure time, the division was not there before the colonial logic of time came in India. In the Western culture, it came with the Newtonian time presence of time. That time can be quantifiable, right? The quantifiability of time, the division of time as per different structural units, led to the concept of work time. অ্যান্টনি গিডিনসের একটা বই আছে সোশিওলজি অফ টাইম নিয়ে, তোমরা পড়ে নিতে পারো. সেই বইয়ে উনি কিন্তু এই কনসেপ্ট অফ ওয়ার্ক টাইম কিভাবে এলো, কিভাবে লেবার টাইম, ওয়ার্ক টাইম এগুলো একটার সঙ্গে একটা কিভাবে রিলেটেড হলো, সেই নিয়ে কিন্তু অ্যান্টনি গিডেন্স বলছেন ওই বইতে. তো I am not going to Giddens here, but let me put it very concretely, that the question of work time, or the division between work time and leisure time, was derived from Europe. It was not there in India. And that's why one if someone would not use time appropriately, quote unquote appropriately, or according to the utilitarian impulse, that person would invariably suffer from social stigma or social barrages. সোশ্যাল ব্যারেজ তাকে ফেস করতে হতো, সোশ্যাল ব্যারাকিং তাকে ফেস করতে হতো. And that's what is happening in case of Tridip. Tridip in a way is an idler. Tridip in a way does not conform to the colonial logic of biopolitics, colonial logic of using body according to a prefabricated, according to a prefixed notion of time. So there is no imbrication between Tridip's body and the utilitarian view of time. Rather, there is a disjunction. And that's why Tridip was also a rebel. And Thakuma, the grandmother, did not approve of that, as she was colonially interpolated. She was governed by the colonial logic of work culture, and Tridip was a misfit in that. And therefore, the grandmother didn't want the narrator to be like Tridip, to be like Trideep. Clear? So this is how Trideep was also a rebel. And that's why Trideep was attractive to the narrator. The narrator had an, an irrepressible attraction for Trideep and Maya Devi because of their rebellious nature, because of their transgressive nature. It did not sound terrible, but in fact, in my grandmother's uses, there was nothing very much worse that could be of anyone, right? For her, এই দেখো এই জায়গাটা আমি যেটা তোমাদের এক্ষুনি বলছিলাম, for her time was like a toothbrush. It went moldy if it was not used, right? The question of utilitarian time and the use value and the productivity of time, the utilitarian mechanism of time, that's the Western culture indoctrinated into the Indian consciousness. I asked her once what happened to wasted time. She tossed her small silvery head, screwed up her long nose, and said, "It begins to stink." As for herself, she had been careful to read a little flat of everything that might encourage us to let our time stink. No chessboard nor any pack of cards ever came to our door. There was a battered Ludo set somewhere, but I was allowed to play with only when I was ill. She didn't even approve of my mother listening to the afternoon radio play more than a week. So how authoritarian the grandmother was, it clearly indicates that she was it's not মায়া দেবী, এটা কিন্তু মায়া দেবী নয়, এটা আমাদের কিন্তু ক্লিয়ারলি তোমরা নিশ্চয়ই জানো, নভেলটা নিশ্চয়ই পড়েছো, আমি আর বলছি না যে as for herself she had been careful to get rid of a little flat of everything that might encourage us to let our time stink. No chessboard nor any pack of cards ever came through our door. There was a battered Ludo set. Why is a battered Ludo set? Because the Ludo set was unused. It was torn and tattered and like that. So you cannot have a leisure time at that home. You cannot have a time for recreation. You have to have a routinized, mechanical, banal life. So this Takuma, this grandmother, epitomizes that banal life, that life of banality that the Western culture had imposed on us. And no chessboard, but somewhere I was allowed to play it when it uh, play with it only when I was ill. So only the illness was my leisure. The period of convalescence, that was my leisure. As my body was unfit, I was allowed to play with the Ludo set. Otherwise, I was not. So did not even approve of my mother listening to the afternoon radio play more than once a week. In our flat, we all worked hard at whatever we did. My grandmother at her school mistressing, I at my homework, my mother at her housekeeping, my father at his job as a junior executive in a company which dealt in a vulcanized rubber. So the idea of school mistressing, very interestingly, how the school teachers were interpolated by the idea of a work ethic. Colonial education, if we go back to Thomas Babington Macaulay's system of education brought about ushered in a systemic reform in the work culture of India. And the English education brought in a sense of urgency to work, that you have to be very agile on your toes, you have to be very agile in your mind as well to learn the art of utilizing time. You have to be very utilitarian in your approach. You cannot be wasteful, you cannot be playful, you cannot be frivolous. You should always have a goal to fulfill, you should always have a mission to fulfill, because they incorporated, they instilled into our mind a motto of being successful. You have to have a material success, you have to have a social, you have to climb a social pyramid, and that's why you cannot you cannot escape the work culture. That's why you cannot bypass your work. And schoolmistress, the grandmother being a schoolmistress, was totally interpolated by that ideology. So my grandmother at her schoolmistressing, I at my homework, that is again the question of work comes in. My mother at her housekeeping, it's a different kind of work. My father at his job as a junior executive in a company. So every individual in the family had specific roles, and they were barely allowed to change their roles. They were barely allowed to listen to the radio play or play ludo or things like that. So this is how the routinized existence entrapped the narrator. And in the middle of this routinized existence, the presence of Trideep's memory was like a whiff of fresh air. Presence of Maya Devi was like a window. And that's how Maya Devi and Trideep become a shadowy presence in the life of the narrator. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will end here today. I will begin my lecture again on Monday from these portions. Thank you for listening.